Bienvenido a Café Espacial. Conduce el Dr. Fermín Romero Vázquez. Análisis con líderes expertos e influencers del futuro de la Agencia Espacial Global. Exploración espacial y potencial, extensión de la raza humana en el universo. Ámbitos más prometedores del sector espacial y sus protagonistas en gobierno, industria y servicio, academia y ONGs. Beneficios de la ciencia y tecnología espacial para toda la sociedad. Desde tierra firme, es momento de un café. Café Espacial.
Hola, ¿qué tal, amigos? Buenas tardes. Pues bueno, viernes de Café Espacial, ya saben, todos están cordialmente invitados. Y en esta ocasión tenemos a una gran invitada. Idealmente estaba prevista para un gran científico mexicano que lamentablemente el 28 de enero pues partió de este mundo. Y quisiéramos que este programa fuera un tributo a él porque es un gran científico mexicano, el doctor Rafael Navarro, que trabajó mucho con la NASA en exploraciones sobre Marte. Y por esa razón es que hoy tenemos a una gran invitada, de un gran nivel, que por supuesto trataremos de que ella nos dé un primer acercamiento a este planeta, del cual en lo sucesivo seguiremos hablando con otros expertos, pero por esa ocasión la escogimos a ella, la doctora Tanya. Hello, everybody. Well, this is our second transmission in the English language. And for this session, we choose to the Dr. Tanya Harrison. She's an expert on Mars. And this program is some kind of tribute to Dr. Navarro, Dr. Rafael Navarro, a Mexican scientist who worked with NASA. And Tanya is the director of science and strategy for the foreign arm of Planet Labs. She is also a professional Martian, having worked in the mission operations for NASA Mars orbiters and rovers over the past 13 years. She holds a PhD in geology with a specialization in planetary science and exploration from the University of Western Ontario. She holds a master's in Earth and Environmental and Science from Wesleyan University and a BSc in the Physics and Astronomy from the University of Washington. Tanya is also an avid science communicator, having made appearances in TV, radio, and podcasts around the world. You can also find her prolifically tweeting about Mars, including in Steam on Twitter as Tanya of Mars. Well, Tanya, welcome. In the first blog, we will focus on the importance of the space exploration and why Mars. In the second one, we will be aimed to informing to our audience on what is currently being done on Mars through the robotic missions. And in the third one, I will ask you about the role of agencies and companies in this new stage of space exploration and what we hope to see in the following years. So, my dear Dr. Tanya Harrison, please be welcome in this first program with you in Café Espacial.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, well, let's start with this. Why Mars? Please tell us why we choose Mars for the exploration and what should we go to Mars at all?
Mars is sometimes our nearest neighbor, sometimes the second nearest neighbor. And we've thought for decades that maybe Mars has had life. And so it's the easiest place that we can go in our own solar system to try and answer that question. And it's really answering that existential question of whether or not humans are alone in the universe. And so we've been sending these missions, getting incremental data, learning more and more about what Mars used to be like and how it compares to what Earth used to be like and how Earth is today, so that we can try to actually finally answer that question of whether or not it could have supported life and whether it did support life.
Okay. Everybody says, why we concentrate on Mars exploration when there are so many problems on Earth? What do you tell to these people?
This question comes up a lot for space exploration, and I would say they're not mutually exclusive things. If we stopped exploring space tomorrow, that wouldn't automatically solve all of our problems here on Earth. But doing things towards space exploration also help us here on Earth in terms of technological development, in terms of inspiring people to go into science and engineering fields so that they might not study space themselves, but they might actually be doing something that applies back to Earth. And I would say my career right now is actually a really good example. I spent my whole career working on Mars things and was inspired by NASA and space exploration since I was a child. But now I work for an Earth observing company that is trying to combat climate change, help track human rights abuses around the world, keep an eye on sustainability around the world. And so it's something that is very much tied to bettering human life here on Earth, even though I got to that pathway by coming in through Mars.
Okay. And talking about Mars colonization, what do you think about this? What are your personal view?
I would love to see humans on Mars at some point, but I think a lot of people, especially with the way Elon Musk talks about Mars recently, are viewing Mars as this planet B that we can run away to because we've messed up Earth so much. And we can't look at it that way. Mars is so much harsher than anywhere on Earth. It would be easier for us to live in Antarctica than it would be to live on Mars. And Mars doesn't have a lot of natural resources for us to utilize once we get there. So it's not a plan B. We can't just up and leave Earth and move there. It's going to be a slow process where we send a few people at a time. Again, kind of like Antarctica, we have a science base there where you have, a few hundred scientists and their support staff, but it hasn't really grown much beyond that on the entire continent. And Mars will probably be the same way for a very long time until it gets to a point where it is a little bit more self-sustaining, or we have the ability to be more self-sustaining there. So I would like to see us get there, because I don't think we'll be able to definitively answer the question of whether or not Mars ever had life without sending humans there and more complicated lab equipment than we can fit on the rovers that we have there right now. But it's going to take a while before we reach that point.
Yeah, and thinking about the rest of the planets in the galaxy, what makes Mars special for you?
I'm not sure why Mars has been more fascinating to me than the other planets. I was certainly gravitated toward it as a child because of the Sojourner rover, which was the first rover that humans ever successfully sent to another planet. And I thought it was amazing that we had the ability to launch a robot to another planet, land it successfully, drive it around on the surface and tell it what to do, image that rock, sample that rock, drive over there. We don't get to do that really anywhere else except for sometimes the moon. And so having that tactile interaction between us and a robot on the surface of another planet is something that is very unique to Mars, at least so far in our history of space exploration.
Okay. Well, moving on the same general information about Mars, what are, in your view, of course, what are the dangers from radiation in transit and on the surface of Mars?
It's one of the big concerns that we have for sending humans to Mars, actually, because in everything that we've done so far, like humans on the International Space Station, they're pretty well protected by Earth's magnetic field, which protects it from things like solar energetic particles coming out of the sun, and a little bit from what we call the cosmic microwave background radiation that's just throughout the entire universe. But once you leave the protective bubble of the magnetic field of Earth, you're just in the middle of space, and all of that is going through your spaceship pretty constantly. So there's a danger to human health in terms of getting from Earth to Mars, but then you get to Mars and it doesn't have a magnetic field left anymore. The core of Mars has solidified, unlike the Earth's, and so the magnetic field that it had has died out, and so there's a lot of radiation on the surface. We've measured this with the Curiosity rover and its radiation detector on the surface. So we need to look at things like, how can we build in radiation shielding into our ships to get humans to Mars, but in a way that doesn't make them prohibitively expensive or extremely heavy, so it's expensive to launch them in the first place. And then when you get to Mars, what do we need to do there? Do we build our civilizations underground or build them inside of what we call lava tubes, which are these caves that we see on Mars underneath where the giant volcanoes are? The idea there is just cap off either end, fill it with an atmosphere, and you've got a mostly built container that you can be inside. But then you would be underground, which seems really sad to go all the way to Mars to live in a cave.
Okay. Won't the lack of gravity during the trip to Mars for the astronauts? What do you think on this?
Like, how will it affect their health?
Yeah.
That's a great question too. We have a lot of data from, again, the International Space Station. We've had astronauts live there for a little over a year at a time. So we have an okay idea of how being in microgravity affects the human body. But the trip to Mars is going to be longer than any single human has ever spent in space. It's about a 6 to 8 month trip to get to Mars. And then you'd have to spend 2 years on Mars for it to come back in its orbit to be in a location where humans could then come back to Earth. So it's another 8 months. So you're basically talking almost 5 years round trip to get there, wait, and be able to come back. And you would at least have 1/3 gravity on Mars for that period of time you're waiting there. But we don't really know how spending that long in a low and no gravity environment will impact the human body, because we've never spent any extended time in low gravity. We have, a few months to a year on the space station. We have a few days on the moon at most from the Apollo missions, but we don't really know, long term, if you're in a lower gravity environment but not microgravity, how does that actually affect the human body? And unfortunately, we don't have a way to test that on Earth. The closest thing we can do is there's the KC-135 parabolic plane that takes people through lunar gravity, Martian gravity, and zero gravity when it goes through these parabolas. But those only last for about 30 seconds at a time. And so we're going to be learning a lot about biology from just being on the surface of Mars, because we don't have any other way to really test it.
Yeah, you're right. This is true. But well, changing a little bit on the subject, what are the risks of contaminating Mars with air life forms, or vice versa?
There's probably not much risk of contaminating Earthlings with Mars life forms, because we haven't found any there yet. And if they are there, they're either really deeply buried in the subsurface, or maybe they existed, 3.5, 4 billion years ago when Mars, which was much more habitable, so warmer and wetter than it is today. But there is a concern about contaminating Mars with Earth life forms, because we have tons of microbes that live on us and live on everything around us constantly. And so we really want to be able to say, if we find something that's alive on Mars, that it's something that is natively Martian and isn't something that we brought with us. And so there's a big concern here that if we don't answer that question before we send humans, we might irreversibly contaminate Mars, and we'll never be able to definitively answer the question, because we've contaminated it with all of the things that we bring with us. And humans are just, inherently dirty creatures. There's all these things that live on us. And even though you're going outside on Mars in a spacesuit, for example, you have to touch the pieces of that spacesuit to put it on. Or there's never going to be completely sealed off exchange of air, or lack of exchange of air, from your habitat to the Martian environment. There will be some loss there somewhere, so microbes can get out that way. So that's probably the bigger concern. And there's not really, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. We don't want to contaminate Mars because we want to see if there's life there. But we can't tell if there's life there for sure, probably, until we send humans. So to figure out our priorities there.
Okay. And what is meant by a Mars launch window? Please explain to us.
So like I mentioned before, you have to go to Mars, wait a couple years, and then come back. This is because in order to take the shortest route and use the least amount of fuel, we have to wait for these launch windows that occur once every 2 years, where Mars and Earth get really close in their orbits around the sun. And so we launch at a point where they're really close, and then the rocket will sort of catch up to Mars in its orbit. So that way it takes 6 to 8 months to get there, as opposed to if we launched when the Earth was on one side of the sun and Mars was on the other, it could take you, a year and a half, 2 years to get to Mars, and you wouldn't want to spend that much time in space if you didn't have to.
Okay. Well, before to go into a break, we know that the team of scientists and engineers from NASA Curiosity rover named a mountain, Rafael Navarro Mountain, in the heel of Mars, which is located in Moon Sharp or Northwest Gale Crater. Do you know that? And what can you tell us about this?
I'm not sure much about that specific location, but I can tell you a little bit about Mount Sharp in general. that's helpful.
Okay.
So Mount Sharp is this layered mountain in the middle of Gale Crater where Curiosity has been driving around since 2012. And Gale Crater is huge. It's about 150 kilometers across and 5.5 kilometers deep. And we think that about 3.5 billion years ago, it used to be a lake. And so we sent Curiosity to this crater to look at the layers that were left behind when the water in that lake evaporated away. And so it's been driving up the crater floor and then the lower layers of this mountain, Mount Sharp. And then each place that they go to gets a different name so that we can tell them all apart from each other. And since we've been there for 9 years now, we know that the lake was habitable. So it was the right temperature, the right pH, had all the right chemicals for life to survive, but we don't have the instruments on Curiosity to be able to definitively say if there was or wasn't life in the lake when the water was there.
Okay, let's move into a very quick break, and then we come back to continue talking. Thank you, Dr. Harrison. Okay, we're again with Dr. Tanya Harrison, and she's our special guest to talk about Mars. And for this second block, please, Dr. Tanya Harrison, tell us how many instruments are Perseverance rover?
So Perseverance is pretty decked out. It's got over 25 separate instruments on board between camera systems, a radar system, sampling system, instruments that can tell you what the rocks around the rover are made out of. So it's definitely the most complex suite of science instruments that we've ever sent to Mars.
Okay. And how will Perseverance communicate with Earth? Well, how is this system allow us to communicate with the people? Well, not at this moment, but in the future, and at this time, how is the communication with the rovers?
So the rovers talk to us two different ways. Usually what we do is when the satellites that are orbiting Mars right now from either NASA or the European Space Agency, we might sometimes use the Indian missions, I'm not entirely sure, but whenever they fly over the rover will send all the data to the satellite, and then the satellites will transmit that data back to Earth, because the satellites have much larger dishes on them, and so they can send back data at a higher rate. It's kind of like having a better internet connection, essentially. But if we can't connect with one of the satellites for some reason, there's also what's called a direct-to-Earth antenna on the rover. So the rover can transmit directly to Earth, provided the right face of Mars is pointing toward Earth. So the rover actually has to be line of sight facing Earth. But since the dish is so small on the rover, it's like sending back something over a dial-up modem versus the satellites in orbit as a comparison. Although the data rate from either one is still very slow because Mars is very far away. Even from orbit, it's essentially sometimes like transmitting data over a 56K modem for people that remember dial-up internet. So we can use either one of those ways sort of as like a redundancy in case for some reason the satellite isn't working.
Okay. And when we think in the energy for these rovers in Mars, we think in many different materials. But what is exactly the power source of the Perseverance in Mars?
Since Perseverance is so big and has so many instruments on board, we couldn't use solar panels like we've done for most of the previous missions that we've sent to Mars. So it has a nuclear battery. The technical name for it is a radioisotope thermoelectric generator. So what it is a piece of plutonium that is essentially decaying, and when it decays, it generates heat. And so that heat is then transferred into energy to power the rover. So it generates a few hundred watts of power per day, and that's enough to power all of the instruments on the rover that you might want to run at any given point, but not enough where we could do them, say, all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And how did Perseverance aim toward the right landing spot?
So Perseverance has what's called a sky crane system, where it came in on a parachute to slow it down in the Martian atmosphere. And then at some point the parachute separates, and then you just have this little device that's basically the crane with the rover inside of it coming down with retro rockets to slow it down a little bit more. And the whole piece there with the rover and the retro rockets had a device on it called terrain relative navigation, which we've never sent to Mars before. So this was pretty cool. And it transmitted a radio signal to figure out, am I coming down over an area that is safe for me to land or not? And if it was coming down over, say, a big boulder or something, it could actually move and then land somewhere else. And then when it gets a few meters above the surface, it hovers in one place and then lowers the rover from the crane down onto the surface with cables. Then those cables detach and the sky crane system flies off and crashes far away from the rover so that it doesn't come down on top of the rover itself. And so this is the system very similar to what we used on the Curiosity rover 10 years ago, except Curiosity didn't have the terrain relative navigation aspect. So we learn with each mission how to build a better and better landing system. And it gives us a lot more accuracy in terms of selecting where we want to land. We used to have these landing ellipses, like we call them, that were hundreds of kilometers across. So you only knew you'd be somewhere in that ellipse. And then that's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So for like Perseverance, we landed inside of a crater. We wouldn't have been able to specifically say we wanted to land inside a crater with some of the older missions because our landing was not accurate enough.
Great. In the last weeks, the Ingenuity helicopter has created big expectations from the exploration. What can you tell us on Ingenuity flights?
Ingenuity is amazing. It's this tiny little drone about the size of a cat, so you can hold it in your hands. And it's done 6 flights on Mars so far. It was originally sent as a technology demonstration because the atmosphere on Mars is so thin, we weren't even sure we would be able to fly something in it. And so they built this drone as a test. They flew it in a Mars chamber at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California, and it worked. But you never know if your test environment is going to be exactly like what you get on Mars. So not only has it worked, it's worked almost flawlessly until this most recent flight, on flight number 6. It had a little bit of a software anomaly, but it still landed successfully. They're working on figuring out the anomaly, and it should be okay to go for the next flight. But it's great because we were able to prove that we can fly on Mars with this type of design. And the idea is that we could send these little drones with rovers in the future, because they have cameras on them, to fly ahead of the rover and take pictures, and then hopefully send those pictures back to the rover so the rover can do some autonomous driving. Right now, we have to take pictures from the rover, send them back to Earth. A human pours through them and tries to plot the safest course from point A to point B. But it's really hard to do that from a 2-dimensional image when you're looking in front of you. You know, if we're navigating here on Earth, you're usually looking at a map, which is a top-down view, right? So having that from the drone will be extremely helpful for doing mission planning in the future. But we probably won't do that with Ingenuity just because it's only designed to be a demo. So it doesn't have the full-fledged capabilities that it would have if it was an actual like science instrument or an operational instrument for this mission.
Excellent. And if you had to do an evaluation on the previous rovers like Opportunity, like Curiosity, and the current Perseverance, what would be for you the most important difference among them?
So they've each had a very different science goal for the mission, which influenced the instruments that we put on board. So Opportunity and its twin Spirit, which both landed in January of 2004, they were tasked with a goal of follow the water. So they were looking for signs of where water was in the past on Mars and what the conditions in that water were like. And then Curiosity took the next step to look for signs of habitability. So we went somewhere that we were fairly certain had water, and then tried to figure out if the water in this lake was habitable by life as we know it. And so Perseverance is now taking the next step to look for signs of ancient life. And so it actually has a sampling system on board to collect a few dozen tiny little samples that it's going to drill and put in basically test tubes and leave along the surface of Mars. And then in about 10 years, the European Fetch rover is going to go and collect those samples and send them back to Earth so we can analyze them in a lab here to look for signs of DNA. So we've changed the instruments that we have on each one of these rovers, specifically tailored toward those goals. And now we're finally going to have this sample return system, which is not something we've ever done from Mars before. So this is going to be really exciting.
Yeah. And while changing a little bit the subject and talking about manned flights, do we need to go to the moon first to prepare for Mars mission?
I'm a little torn on that one. I think that if we use the moon as a stepping stone, I'm worried that we will get stuck there, kind of like we've been stuck in low Earth orbit since the Apollo missions. It's been, 40 years since we've gone beyond low Earth orbit. And I don't want to see us get trapped and complacent just being on the moon. On the other hand, learning how to live and work on the moon will give us a lot of knowledge for being able to do that on Mars. But I think that we could also just go straight to Mars and learn there based off of the knowledge that we do have from the Apollo era and from the International Space Station. So there's arguments to be made for both sides. I just would love to see us get to Mars sooner rather than later as humans.
Yeah. But the launches from or refueling stops at a moon base be easier for going straight from Earth to Mars?
Probably. The gravity on the moon is so much lower. It's about 11% of what it is on Earth. So that means it's easier to launch stuff. So you could build bigger things and launch bigger things for much cheaper than it would be to get that mass off of the surface of the Earth. So that's really the biggest upside to launching from the moon.
Isn't it risky to send the crew of a Mars mission separately from their return fuel?
Yes, so there have been some plans to send these refueling missions ahead of time, or these fuel depots essentially that will go and make propellant in place. I imagine that at least for the first few missions, they will probably make sure that the crew still had enough fuel to get home on an emergency flight if they needed to, rather than send them to Mars and they get there only to find out that something has happened and the fuel generation hasn't worked, or the tank has leaked or something like that. So we definitely want to make sure that infrastructure is in place and functional before we didn't have a lifeboat on hand for the crewed missions as they were going to Mars.
Yeah. Also changing a little bit the subject, do you believe asteroid impacts on ancient Mars could have produced key ingredients for life in the Martian atmosphere, rich in nitrogen?
They could have. There's some idea that that's what happened on Earth. The heat generated from these impacts creates habitable environments, because on Earth you have water. And so when you've mixed heat with that from the impacts, usually heat plus water equals life, at least from our experience on a single planet where we have life here. So the idea is that same thing could have happened on Mars. It could have brought in things like amino acids, which we've seen on asteroids. We know Mars has water right now and had much more water in the past. And so maybe we got these key ingredients delivered to Mars from asteroids, the same way that we think maybe that's what happened on Earth from asteroids or comets.
Yeah. And regarding this, how do you think it's the current technology to think about habitats in Mars?
So a lot of what we know, we've learned from the space station in terms of things like life support systems, air recycling, water recycling, growing hydroponic food or aeroponic food where you don't need a lot of soil, which is going to be a problem on Mars for sure. But we haven't built, like a big sustained habitat on a place like the moon, for example. And we've done a few samples on Earth where we've tried to build these contained habitats, like Biosphere 2 in Arizona is one example. But they still haven't had a great success rate of making them entirely self-contained. So that is one case where maybe the moon argument does come into play. Maybe we should practice building a base on the moon so that we know how to do it correctly before we try to go to do the same thing on Mars. But again, I'm worried that would take up so much time and cost so much money that there wouldn't be any resources left to try to do it on Mars.
Yeah, talking about these issues is impossible to not think about The Martian, that film that caused a lot of amazing information around Mars. What do you think of this picture? Are we very different from the possibilities to colonize Mars, or it is quite possible?
I think in terms of the technology, we have almost everything that we need because a lot of it we've already developed. It's more we need the money and the political will, essentially. So no matter how you try to do it, sending humans to Mars is going to be incredibly expensive. And so it's probably not feasible that one country will do it alone. Even the rovers that we have there now, like Perseverance and Curiosity, they're run by NASA, but they are extremely international missions. There's instruments on board, each one built by France. There's one on Curiosity built by Russia. I think both Curiosity and Perseverance have an instrument on board built by Spain, by Norway. So like these are already international missions. And so if we're going to send humans to another planet, it shouldn't just be one country anyway, right? We're expanding to another world. We should involve as many nations as possible, as many different kinds of people as possible. And so that plus deciding that this should be a priority for like budgets of different countries is probably going to be the key. So until somebody actually decides, yes, this is something we want to do as a nation or as a group of nations, that's probably the biggest holdup for it to happen. Other than if, Elon Musk just decides to spend his own money and get people to go, in which case, maybe it happens in the next 10 years because he has the money to do it.
Yes. And the other hand, for example, you mentioned Elon Musk, but on the other hand, Blue Origin and also Beagle, you also work for Beagle Space. How are do they have capacities to make the fight to Elon Musk, for example, do you think, or not?
None of the other companies are really that focused on Mars. Like Jeff Bezos, who owns Blue Origin, is really, really focused on the moon. And then you've got Richard Branson, who runs Virgin Galactic. He's really focused on sort of getting humans into low Earth orbit for like space travel, space tourism. So Elon is kind of unique in that his sights are set fully on Mars. And I think the difference there is there's not a strong economic benefit to going to Mars. He's not going to go there and like mine something that will make a lot of money, and you're not going to make a bunch of money off tourists going to Mars anytime in the near future, probably, 10, 20 years. Whereas trying to sell tourist flights to low Earth orbit from Virgin or Blue Origin, like that's something that's much more tangible. They've already sold tickets to do that. Or trying to build something on the moon is only, a couple day trip away. So it's a lot easier to kind of sell that idea and have some kind of economic payoff for it. Whereas Elon is just, I want to go to Mars because I want to do this and I have a lot of money. I've developed technology. I'm just going to go.
Yes, you're right. Well, let's go to the second break, and then we will go to the third block to talk about the future. Okay. Well, we come back again with our special guest, Dr. Tanya Harrison. And in this third block, we will talk about the future of space exploration in Mars. And first of all, Tanya, tell us, what are NASA and SpaceX doing to prepare for humans to Mars missions?
So NASA has a Journey to Mars program they've been working on where their plan is to send humans to Mars orbit in the early 2030s, and then probably not down to the surface until like late 2030s, around 2040, sometime around there. And SpaceX is being much more ambitious. The original plan was to send Starship to Mars by, I think they wanted to send their first mission in 2024. That's probably not going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if they sent it before 2030, or at least before NASA does at this point, just because there's so much more focused on the SpaceX side because it is a commercial company and they can follow whatever Elon wants to do, whereas NASA as a government institute is stuck to the political whims of whatever presidential administration comes in. And so every time there's a new president, the goals of NASA tend to change. And that's no fault of NASA whatsoever. It's just the way that the government system is set up. So, we had Donald Trump wanted to go back to the moon, and then we had Obama wanted to do this asteroid redirect mission, and then we had the moon again, and we had Mars. As far as you go back, it just keeps changing. So unfortunately, that's part of why it's so slow to get these human missions moving forward from a government space agency side. But the thing that I admire about like the SpaceX view is by throwing a number out there like 2024, that's a tangible number. Like that's something we can envision in our own lives. And so I think it makes people want to work harder toward making that a reality, as opposed to saying, well, we're not going to send humans to Mars until 2040. That's something that feels a lot less tangible. I can think about what my life will be like in 2024, but I can't accurately picture what my life is going to be like in 2040. So even though the timelines that SpaceX tends to set are not necessarily realistic, Elon admits that he calls them aspirational timelines because it makes people like driven toward trying to make that happen. And I kind of like that approach. So I'm sure we'll meet somewhere in the middle between, SpaceX at 2024 and NASA at more like, 2030, 2035. So maybe one of the two of them will end up at Mars somewhere around 2030. I certainly hope, at least.
Yeah, you're right. What is USA and the other space foreign nations doing politically to push for human Mars missions? What do you think of that?
So there's some collaboration right now between the United States through NASA and the European Space Agency to develop technology for things like the Orion crew capsule, which is being designed to send humans to Mars on the Space Launch System rocket, or SLS. And that's the massive rocket that NASA's been working on for well over a decade, which has been embroiled in some controversy because it's taken so long to develop and still hasn't actually really launched yet. They've just done some tests. But so we're seeing some international collaboration there in terms of actually developing the technology to send humans into space. Then you have countries like China that are working on things related to human space flight. They're building another space station. I don't know what their timeline is for wanting to send humans to the moon, but since they've had a couple of successful lunar rovers, I imagine it's not terribly far off. And right now they aren't really working very closely with any other countries other than Russia. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. The collaboration between the United States and Russia in terms of space seems to be crumbling a little bit because of the political atmosphere. But now that we have a new presidential administration, we'll see how that changes. We just got the new NASA administrator appointed in the last few weeks. So we'll see what that relationship looks like as we move into the next couple of years or so.
Yeah, you're right. In the last years, the international cooperation among almost the most important space countries was good in the International Space Station, but right now there's a big difference. Very recently, Russia announced a collaboration with China, and there is starting a new kind of rivalization among the states and Russia. So there are new rules on the international cooperation. This is a new stage, so let's see what will happen. And what we will see in the following year regarding Mars exploration? This is, talking about the next. You mentioned weeks, decades, sorry, but what do we expect in the near future? 25, 30 years.
Like looking that far out, I imagine we'll start to see hopefully more rovers on the surface. We'll probably have a next generation Mars orbiter because NASA hasn't sent like a surface focused mission actually since 2006 with the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. There's a slightly newer mission from 2014 called MAVEN, but it's only studying the atmosphere. So we're going to need a replacement for the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter at some point because it will run out of fuel in the late 2020s or so. And the instruments will probably stop functioning at some point before that because they're quite old. My hope is that we would see the first little bits of a permanent human presence on Mars, not just these sort of flag and footprint missions like we had with Apollo, where we went, planted a flag, walked around for a little bit, did a little bit of science, but then came home. It's so expensive to get to Mars. It takes so much time that we might as well plan it out really well so that whatever we're taking there with us on any trip is something that builds toward that longer term goal of this sustained, like permanent human presence on the surface. So I would hope that we would maybe have a few hundred people living on Mars in the next 25 to 30 years. We'll see if that actually happens.
Yeah. And moving to the budget first, there are some amounts that in the newspapers we can read, but how much will sending humans to Mars cost? Do you know, or do you have an approximation to the amount?
I think the estimate that was given by like Robert Zubrin in his case for Mars, which is the architecture a lot of people tend to cite, was somewhere around $90 billion, which is a lot of money. I mean, NASA's annual budget is only 20 to 25 billion, depending on what year it is. And that's still orders of magnitude more than pretty much any other country with a space agency. I work with the Canadian Space, and I used to work with the Canadian Space Agency back in the day, and their budget is like $325 million. So this is where it's really highlighted that getting to Mars would have to be this multi-year, multinational effort. But those numbers from the case for Mars were also implemented or dreamed up, in the late 80s, early 90s kind of frame of what space travel was like, when space missions to launch them were hundreds of millions of dollars. And now we're in this whole new paradigm where SpaceX is launching things for, $60 million, and we can reuse things that we were never able to reuse before. And so the costs of everything have come down by like almost an order of magnitude. And so I think that we're going to have to sit down and kind of reassess what that cost would actually be, what we can actually reuse, what we need to bring with us, what we can utilize on Mars, and see if there's actually a much lower number now, because that whole paradigm of what we're operating in space has changed. I'm not sure if SpaceX has released a full price tag for what they think like the actual crewed mission of like Starship would be to go to Mars. There's certainly costs floating around out there for the cost of launching Starship. But since they're only the launch provider, they like to highlight that part. Like the rest of the architecture is something that the larger community would have to be working on to figure out that total price tag.
Yes. And why are the cost estimates for a Mars mission so different?
I think a lot of it depends on, is it coming from NASA? Is it coming from a private company? What kind of technology is being used there? What are the timelines that you're looking at? Because obviously, if you're spending, say, 10 years developing your mission, that's going to cost a lot more because it's taking so long compared to spending 2 or 3 years designing your mission. This is something that comes into play when you're developing even just robotic missions. The time that you're spending developing it before you launch it, that's still, all of that time costs money. And so if you can tighten up that time span, get more to this agile aerospace approach that the whole new space industry is trying to take, you can cut down a lot of those like sort of overhead costs, for lack of a better word, to try to just get those designs out there and just launch it, just try these things. So we'll see like highly different prices depending on who you're asking. Is it an old space company like a Boeing or a Lockheed Martin? Is it a new space company like SpaceX? Or is it NASA trying to take this sort of old space approach, but also they're also taking a lot of like redundancy and safety precautions into account that might be seen as overkill by like the new space industry. They might not be quite as careful. So there's a lot of different factors that come into like how they're getting these prices at the end of the day.
Yeah. Okay. Well, our audience is composed for a very huge amount of people, young people. There are students, most of them, in the different levels. What can you tell to these people, to the young people, regarding Mars exploration? What if you have to inspire these young people, what can you tell to them?
I'd say if you're a student right now, this is a really exciting time to get involved with Mars exploration, because we're right at the beginning of what looks like it's going to be this huge explosion in the next 10 years between what private companies are doing, having perseverance on the surface. Other countries now are joining the ranks of working on Mars. So it's a fantastic time to get involved. And even if you're not a scientist or an engineer, working on these missions takes way more people than that. We have artists, we have administrative staff, we have doctors, like anything you can think of. If you like space, you can probably relate it to space in some way. So I like to remind people that we're not all just scientists and engineers. If you love Mars and you want to contribute to Mars exploration or space exploration in general, there are a lot of different ways that you can do that than just being a scientist or an engineer.
I think you're a good example that you love Mars since a long time ago, and I think you can be also a good example for many girls in Mexico. So,
thank you.
Not only Mexico, because this program it's in around the world. So we have audience from different countries. So when I see you and you're very young, you are a girl very focused on Mars, and there is a special reason to love Mars.
I think it's the place that will tell us how special Earth is or not in our own solar system. You know, are we alone? Why did we have two planets next to each other that were both very much like Earth, 3.5-4 billion years ago, but now they're so different sitting next to each other as planetary neighbors? And I think trying to answer that question is what fascinates me the most. I just want to know what happened to Mars, and were we always alone in the solar system, or is there still life there somewhere?
Yeah. Okay, well, we know that Planet Labs, the enterprise you work for, is an spin-off of NASA. And what exactly you do over there, and are they related to the space missions, particularly to Mars?
So Planet doesn't do anything related to Mars. They're very much Earth focused. And so my role is I work mostly with NASA for Planet to help the research community use Planet Earth observation imagery in their science, and then also communicate what the scientists are doing internally at Planet, so that the folks that work for us that are maybe not scientists or maybe not engineers can understand how this data is being used. Because a lot of people come to Planet to work for the idea of the company, which was see change the world. And the other model we use is you can't fix what you can't see. And so by watching things like how climate change is impacting our planet on a day-to-day basis, we're actually making an impact when it comes to scientific research and policy and all of these other areas. And so it's great to actually be able to take what's being done and then show people internally at the company, like, look at what all of your work is doing. Like, because of you, scientists are able to, answer these questions or see what's happening here and respond to a natural disaster over here. And that part is really rewarding, because a lot of times they don't have any idea necessarily like what's being done. You have people building satellites and they go out the door, and that might be the last thing they ever hear from it. So helping them see the actual payoff of what they're doing is really great.
Okay, well, we are almost in the last part of the program. So at this time, I ask you to what to say after you talk very different issues about Mars. What is your conclusion? What can you conclude for the audience regarding Mars in general, regarding the missions, the current missions on Mars, and the future or the expectations in the near future? What can you conclude?
These missions are really important at providing inspiration to so many people around the world to get them excited about science and technology and the future of humanity. It gives us a bright thing to look forward to think that maybe we could one day live on another planet and expand and make humanity a multiplanetary species. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing, to have this big long-term goal that we could be working toward as a species together. So
are you sure that as a species we are going to colonize Mars, right?
I think so. I certainly hope so. And I want to see it happen in my
Me too,
lifetime.
no problem. But
Yeah.
I just want to be sure of that. Okay. And finally, please, some words to say goodbye to our audience. Please, dear Dr. Tanya Harrison.
Oh, thank you everybody so much for tuning in. I hope you learned something about Mars. And if you're always curious to learn more, there's tons of resources online through NASA's website. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me as @Tanya of Mars. And I'm always happy to answer questions on there if you want to ask about missions or what it's like working as a scientist or how you can become a scientist working in space missions. So definitely check it out. And thanks so much for having me on the show today.
Thank you, dear Tanya of Mars. We will follow you as we do in the last years, and a lot of success in your career. You are a very smart girl, and we hope to continue seeing you around the world talking about Mars. Thank you very much for this beautiful talk, and let's keep in touch. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you.